Sometimes the loneliest people carry the strongest hearts. Clara Whitfield knew that truth better than most. A widowed schoolteacher in Ash Hollow, mocked for her plain face and calloused hands, spending cold nights chopping wood just to survive. When mountain man Silas Boone rode into town needing help to rebuild his burned homestead, everyone turned away. Everyone except Clara. He looked at her worn hands and said something no one ever had. Didn't come looking for pretty, came looking for strong. Working side by side, two forgotten souls found something neither expected. Respect, then friendship, then love built on grit instead of glances. But when Silas's violent past rode back into town, Clara would face her greatest test. Could a woman who'd never felt worthy of love find the courage to fight for it? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. The morning sun crept over the Bitterroot Mountains like an old friend who'd worn out his welcome, casting long shadows across Ash Hollow's single dirt road. Clara Whitfield stood at the window of her small schoolhouse, watching dust motes dance in the early light, her fingers wrapped around a chipped tin cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She'd been awake since 4, as she was every morning, stoking the fire in her cabin, preparing lessons, and trying to convince herself that today would be different from all the others. It never was. The schoolhouse bell hung above her head, cracked down the middle from some long-ago accident, but it still rang true enough to call the children in from their play. Clara had polished it just yesterday, even though no one but her would notice. That was the thing about being invisible. You kept trying to be seen anyway. She heard the children's voices before she saw them, a chorus of shouts and laughter that pierced the morning quiet. Mary Beth Hutchins was first through the door, her blonde braids bouncing, followed by the Dalton boys, twins who couldn't sit still if their lives depended on it. Then came little Samuel Chen, clutching his slate to his chest like a shield, and the others, 12 in all, the sum total of Ash Hollow's future. "Good morning, Miss Whitfield," they chimed in practiced unison. "Good morning, children. Take your seats, please." Clara moved through the morning lessons with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing this for 7 years. Reading first, then arithmetic, then a bit of history about the Lewis and Clark expedition that had passed through these very mountains decades before any of them were born. She loved teaching, loved the way young minds opened up like flowers when they finally grasped a difficult concept. It was the only time she ever felt truly necessary. At noon, she dismissed them for lunch, and they scattered like startled quail, racing toward the general store where their mothers waited with wrapped sandwiches and stern reminders to mind their manners. Clara ate alone at her desk, bread and cheese she'd made herself, an apple from the tree behind her cabin that was more stubborn than productive. Through the window, she could see Main Street's meager commerce, Mrs. Dalton sweeping the porch of the general store, Mayor Hutchins pontificating to anyone who'd listen outside the land office, old Mr. Chen repairing a wagon wheel with the patience of a man who'd learned his craft across an ocean. This was Ash Hollow, a town of maybe 60 souls, clinging to the edge of civilization like moss to a rock. Clara had been born here 29 years ago, to parents who'd come west with dreams bigger than their wagon could carry. Her father had been a farmer, her mother a seamstress, both dead now from the fever that swept through 5 winters past. She'd married Thomas Whitfield when she was 23, a quiet man who worked at the lumber mill and treated her with gentle kindness. He'd called her beautiful once on their wedding night, and she'd known even then that he was lying. But she'd loved him for the lie. Thomas had been crushed by a falling tree 2 years into their marriage. She'd been a widow at 25, and the town had closed around her like a fist, offering sympathy that felt more like pity, help that came with judgment attached. "Poor Clara," they'd whisper. "Plain as a fence post and now alone. Who'll have her now?" She'd heard it all. The comments about her strong jaw, her wide shoulders, her hands that were better suited to a blacksmith than a bride. The way the unmarried men looked past her at church socials, their eyes sliding away as if she were furniture. The way married women patted her arm and told her that surely God had a plan, though none of them could say what it might be, so Clara had stopped hoping for rescue. She'd taken the teaching position, moved into the small cabin Thomas had built, and learned to split her own wood, mend her own roof, and exist in the careful solitude that came from being perpetually overlooked. The afternoon lessons dragged, as they always did. The children grew restless, and Clara let them go early, watching them stream out into the autumn afternoon, like water finding its course. She tidied the schoolhouse, swept the floor, arranged the slates in neat rows for tomorrow. Then she locked the door and walked a quarter-mile to her cabin, her boots kicking up little clouds of dust that settled on her dark skirts. The cabin sat at the edge of town, backed up against a stand of pine trees that whispered secrets in the wind. It was small, just 2 rooms, a main living space with a fireplace and a tiny bedroom, barely big enough for the narrow bed Thomas had made. But it was hers, paid for with her teaching salary and her stubborn refusal to accept charity. Inside, she hung her shawl on the peg by the door and surveyed her domain. The fire had burned down to embers. The water bucket needed filling. The wood pile outside was running low, which meant an hour's work with the axe before dark. She rolled up her sleeves and got to it, the way she always did. Chopping wood had become a meditation. Each swing of the axe was a small rebellion against the world that had written her off. Each split log was proof that she didn't need a man to survive, even if some part of her, the part she tried not to listen to, still wanted one. She worked until her shoulders ached and sweat dampened her collar, until the woodpile was restocked and the water bucket filled from the creek. Then she went inside, built up the fire, and began preparing her supper, beans and bacon, cornbread if she had the energy. She ate alone at the small table, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional call of a nighthawk outside. After supper, she sat in the rocking chair Thomas had made, the one that still smelled faintly of him if she concentrated, and mended a tear in one of her students' coats. Mary Beth Hutchins had caught it on a nail, and her mother couldn't be bothered. Clara would return it tomorrow, freshly mended, and Mary Beth would smile at her with gap-toothed gratitude. These were the rhythms of her life, predictable, safe, lonely. She thought about Thomas sometimes, late at night when the cabin felt too empty. She'd loved him in her way, though it had been more companionship than passion. He'd been kind. He'd never made her feel inadequate, but he'd also never made her feel seen, not really. She'd been a practical choice for him, a woman who could cook and clean and wouldn't complain about the hardships of frontier life. And she'd accepted that because it had seemed like the best she could hope for. Now, sitting in the gathering darkness, Clara wondered if this was all there would ever be. Teaching other people's children, mending other people's clothes, chopping wood alone, while the years piled up like cordwood, and her hands grew harder and her heart grew quieter. She rose and went to the bedroom, changed into her nightdress, and climbed into bed. Tomorrow would be the same as today, and the day after that, and the day after that, unless something changed. But nothing ever changed in Ash Hollow. Outside, in the distance, she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road. A late traveler, probably, passing through on the way to somewhere more important. She closed her eyes and let the sound fade into the darkness, unaware that everything she'd just accepted as unchangeable truth was about to be proven wrong. The rider came into town just after dawn, when the mist still clung to the valley floor like a living thing. Clara was walking to the schoolhouse, her arms full of books, when she heard the horse's hooves strike the hard-packed earth of Main Street. She stopped, along with everyone else who happened to be out that early, and watched. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than out of it. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind into something that might have been handsome once, but was now just hard. A scar ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, pale against tanned skin. He wore working clothes, canvas pants, a worn shirt, a leather vest that had seen better days. No gun belt, Clara noticed, but a rifle in a scabbard on his saddle. He rode slowly down Main Street, his eyes taking in the town with the methodical assessment of a man who'd learned to evaluate his surroundings quickly. When he reached the land office, he dismounted with a slight stiffness that suggested old injuries, tied his horse to the rail, and went inside. Clara continued to the schoolhouse, but her mind wasn't on her lessons. Something about the stranger had caught her attention, not his appearance, though he was certainly striking, but the air of quiet purpose he carried. This wasn't a drifter passing through. This was a man with intentions. By mid-morning, the whole town knew his name and his business. Silas Boone. He'd bought property 5 miles north, up in the foothills, 2 years back. Had built a cabin there, started clearing land, begun the hard work of carving a life from wilderness. Then 6 months ago, his cabin had burned. He'd been away at the time, buying supplies in a town 2 days' ride east. When he'd returned, there'd been nothing left but ash and charred timber. He'd spent the month since living rough, working odd jobs in neighboring settlements, saving money. Now he was back, ready to rebuild, and he needed help. At noon, Mayor Hutchins called an impromptu town meeting in front of the general store. Clara dismissed her students early and joined the gathering crowd. Standing at the back where she usually positioned herself, present but not prominent, Silas Boone stood on the store's porch, his hat in his hands, addressing the assembled townspeople with a directness that Clara found refreshing after years of the mayor's bloviating. "I'm not asking for charity," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm offering fair wages for honest work. I need help clearing the burned timber, laying a new foundation, raising walls. It's hard labor, and it'll take most of a month, maybe more. But I pay in coin, not promises, and I work alongside anyone who signs on." There was a long silence. Clara watched the faces around her, saw the calculations happening behind their eyes. The work would be brutal, everyone knew it, and 5 miles into the foothills meant being away from town, from family, from the comfort and safety of community. "What happened to your place?" old Mr. Patterson called out. "Fire don't usually just happen on its own." Something flickered across Silas's face, quick as lightning, then was gone. "No, sir, it don't. I've got my suspicions about what happened, but suspicions don't rebuild walls. You bring trouble with you?" This from Mayor Hutchins, puffing himself up with self-importance. "I surely hope not," Silas said. "But I'm an honest man asking for honest help. If that's trouble in Ash Hollow, then I apologize for the inconvenience." More silence. Clara saw men shifting their weight, looking at their boots, finding reasons to be anywhere but in Silas Boone's line of sight. She understood. Life on the frontier was hard enough, without taking on extra burdens, especially for a stranger who might bring complications no one wanted. She surprised herself by speaking. "What are the wages?" Every head turned to look at her. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her eyes on Silas. He studied her for a long moment, his grey eyes steady. $1.50 a day. Meals provided. Work runs dawn to dusk. "That's fair," Clara said. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, "I'll do it." The crowd erupted in murmurs and whispers. Mrs. Dalton actually gasped. Mayor Hutchins looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. "Miss Whitfield," the mayor began, his voice dripping with condescension, "surely you're not serious. This is men's work. Heavy labor. Not suitable for a woman?" Clara finished. She looked around at the assembled men, none of whom had volunteered. "Seems to me Mr. Boone needs workers, not commentary. I'm strong enough to do the job. I've kept my own place running for 3 years without help. But you're teaching," Mrs. Dalton interjected. "School's in session until 3. I can work evenings and Saturdays. That's more than anyone else is offering." Silas Boone was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He stepped down from the porch and walked over to where she stood. Up close, he was even bigger than she'd thought, but there was nothing threatening in his approach. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I appreciate the offer, but the mayor's not entirely wrong. The work's hard. I've got timber to clear, holes to dig, logs to haul. You'll need men for that." Clara met his eyes. She'd spent too many years being dismissed to let it happen again, even from someone with good intentions. "I've been chopping my own wood for 3 years, Mr. Boone. I can swing an axe as well as any man here. Better than some." She saw the flicker of respect in his eyes before he could hide it. He looked at her hands, still holding her school books, and she saw him notice the calluses, the strength in her grip. "You're the teacher," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara Whitfield. Yes, he nodded slowly, working through something in his mind. Then he looked past her at the rope coiled on the store's porch, the same rope old Mr. Patterson had been selling for years. "Can you handle rope work? Tie a proper knot that'll hold weight?" "My father was a farmer. I learned knots before I learned letters." Something shifted in Silas's expression. He turned to address the crowd again, his voice carrying across the gathered townspeople. "This lady here has more courage than the lot of you. She's willing to work when none of you are. I reckon I just found my first hire." He looked back at Clara. "But I'll make it clear, Miss Whitfield, I won't have you working beyond your capability. You tell me when something's too much, and we adjust. Pride's worth nothing if you get yourself hurt. Agreed?" Clara felt something loosen in her chest. Something she hadn't even realized was wound tight. He wasn't humoring her. He wasn't dismissing her. He was treating her like a person whose word and capability mattered. "Agreed," she said. "Then we start Saturday morning. I'll pick you up at dawn." The crowd dispersed slowly, people shooting glances at Clara that ranged from disapproval to confusion to something that might have been grudging admiration. Mrs. Dalton caught her arm as she turned to go back to the schoolhouse. "Clara, dear, are you certain about this? That man, we don't know anything about him. And the impropriety of a single woman working alone with a strange man. I'm a widow, Mrs. Dalton, not a maiden. And I'll be working, not courting. There's a difference, but what will people say?" Clara looked at the older woman, at her pinched face full of concern that was really just nosiness dressed up as care, and felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years. Defiance, freedom, choice. Let them say what they will. They've been talking about me since Thomas died. At least now they'll have something interesting to discuss. She walked back to the schoolhouse, her head high, aware that she'd just changed the course of her carefully ordered life. The afternoon lessons passed in a blur. She couldn't quite focus, her mind already moving ahead to Saturday, to the work that waited, to the man who'd looked at her hands and seen capability instead of inadequacy. That evening, after chopping her own wood and eating her solitary supper, Clara sat in Thomas's rocking chair and allowed herself to feel the flutter of anticipation that had taken root somewhere beneath her breastbone. It wasn't attraction, she told herself. It was just the prospect of something different, something that broke the monotonous rhythm of her days. But as she lay in bed that night, she found herself thinking about grey eyes that assessed without judging, about a voice that spoke plain truth, about the way Silas Boone had stood on that porch and called her courageous in front of the whole town. No one had ever called her courageous before. She fell asleep with her father's work gloves, laid out on the chair beside her bed, ready for Saturday morning, ready for whatever came next. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that promised hard work and honest sweat. Clara was awake before dawn, dressed in her oldest work dress, a sturdy grey cotton that had seen her through 3 winters of wood chopping and roof patching. She pulled on her father's old work gloves, the leather cracked and soft with age, the fingers too long for her hands but broken in just right. They'd been his, passed down when he died, and wearing them always made her feel connected to his quiet wisdom about the dignity of labor. Silas arrived exactly at dawn, riding a sturdy gelding and leading a second horse, a gentle mare with kind eyes. He dismounted when he saw Clara waiting on her porch, her small pack of supplies at her feet. "Morning, Miss Whitfield. Morning, Mr. Boone. You didn't have to bring a horse for me. I can walk. 5 miles through rough country? Not practical. Besides, Belle here needs the exercise." He gestured to the mare. "She's gentle, won't give you any trouble." Clara approached the horse, let Belle sniff her hand, then stroked the soft nose. She'd grown up around horses, though it had been years since she'd ridden. She mounted with only a slight hesitation, settling into the saddle with the muscle memory of childhood. They rode in silence at first, following the trail that wound up into the foothills. The morning light filtered through the pines, painting everything gold and green. Clara breathed in the scent of pine sap and dry grass, feeling something loosen inside her chest with each mile they put between themselves and town. "You ride well," Silas observed after a while. "My father kept horses before the fever took him. I'm sorry for your loss. It was 5 years ago." "The sorry doesn't sting as much now." They fell back into comfortable silence. Clara noticed how Silas sat his horse, relaxed but alert, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. Military training, she thought. Or maybe just the wariness that came from living alone in wild country. When they reached the property, Clara understood why no one had volunteered. The devastation was complete. Where the cabin had stood, there was only a blackened foundation, charred timber scattered like broken bones across scorched earth. The clearing that Silas had carved from the forest was reclaiming itself, weeds growing up through the ash, saplings taking root in corners where they shouldn't be. But beyond the destruction, Clara could see the promise. The land itself was good, flat enough for building, with a creek running clear through the southern edge, timber plentiful on all sides, and a view that stretched down the valley toward the mountains. This could be something, she thought. This could be a real home. "I know it looks bad," Silas said, dismounting, "but the foundation's still solid. Stone doesn't burn. And I saved some of the hardware, hinges, nails, tools I'd stored in the root cellar." Clara slid down from Belle, her legs stiff from the ride. She walked to the edge of the foundation, studying the layout. "You'd built a good-sized place. 2 rooms. I was planning to add more later." He paused, something flickering across his face. Had different plans then, she didn't push. Instead, she set down her pack and pulled off her bonnet. "Where do we start?" For just a moment, she saw surprise in his eyes, as if he'd expected her to balk at the scope of the work. Then he nodded. "All business, clearing the burned timber first. We need to separate what's salvageable from what's not. Anything that's more char than wood gets hauled to a burn pile. Anything with good timber left gets cut and stacked. It's tedious work, and you'll be black with soot by noon. Then I'll match the timber," Clara said, and was rewarded with the first real smile she'd seen from him. They worked through the morning, Silas showing her how to evaluate each piece of wood, how to spot hidden rot that the fire had exposed, how to stack the good lumber so it would season properly. He was patient without being condescending, correcting her mistakes matter-of-factly and acknowledging when she did something right. Clara quickly lost herself in the rhythm of the work. Lift, evaluate, sort, stack. Her muscles protested at first, but she pushed through, determined not to show weakness. The gloves protected her hands, but couldn't stop the ache that spread through her shoulders and back. By midday, she was exhausted, covered in soot, and happier than she'd been in months. Silas called a halt for lunch, and they sat on the stone foundation, sharing the food he'd brought, thick slices of bread, hard cheese, smoked venison, and coffee from a thermos that had seen better days. Clara ate gratefully, too hungry to care about manners. "You're doing good work," Silas said between bites. "Better than I expected. You thought I'd give up by now. Thought you might have second thoughts at least. Most people do when they see what the job actually entails." Clara looked out across the clearing, at the piles of sorted timber, at the work still ahead. "I stopped having the luxury of second thoughts when my husband died, Mr. Boone. You do what needs doing, or you don't survive. That's frontier life." He studied her with those steady grey eyes. "You can call me Silas. Mr. Boone was my father, and he wasn't a man worth honouring with formality. Then you should call me Clara." "Fair enough." He poured her more coffee. "Your husband? How long's it been?" 3 years this past spring. Logging accident. You loved him?" The question should have felt intrusive, but somehow it didn't. "I respected him. He was kind to me." "That counts for something." Silas nodded, understanding in his silence. They finished eating, and Clara noticed how he moved when he stood, favouring his left side slightly, an old injury making itself known. "You hurt yourself?" she asked. "Old wound. Acts up when I work too hard." "Nothing to worry about? From the war?" He stilled, then looked at her sharply. What makes you think I was in a war? The way you sit a horse. The way you scan the tree line every few minutes. The scar on your face. My father served in the Mexican War. I recognize the signs. Silas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. I served. Did things I'm not proud of. Saw things I wish I could forget. That part of my life is over, but it follows you anyway. It does. He met her eyes. That bother you? Clara thought about it honestly. No, we've all got things that follow us. At least yours came from serving your country. That's more than most can say. Something shifted between them in that moment, a understanding passing wordlessly. They both carried weights. They both knew what it meant to keep moving despite them. The afternoon work went faster, their movements falling into sync. Clara learned to anticipate what Silas needed, handing him tools before he asked, positioning timber so he could make clean cuts. He in turn adjusted the work to her strengths, giving her tasks that used her precision rather than brute force. By the time the sun started its descent toward the mountains, they'd cleared half the burned timber and established neat piles of salvageable wood. Clara's dress was ruined, her face streaked with soot, her muscles screaming. She'd never felt more accomplished. We did good work today, Silas said, surveying their progress. Real good work. They rode back to town as dusk settled over the valley, both too tired for much conversation. When they reached Clara's cabin, Silas helped her down from Bell with a gentlemanly hand that surprised her. Same time next Saturday? He asked. I'll be ready. Clara? She turned back to look at him. Thank you for showing up, for doing the work. It means more than you know. She watched him ride away into the gathering darkness, then went inside and collapsed into Thomas's rocking chair, too exhausted to even build up the fire. But before she fell asleep, still dressed in her ruined work clothes, she found herself smiling. She'd been useful today, necessary, seen. It was a good feeling. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm that became familiar, then comforting. Clara taught her students during the week, and every Saturday she rode up to Silas's property, worked until her body ached, then rode home, exhausted and satisfied. The townspeople watched with varying degrees of disapproval and curiosity, but Clara found she cared less with each passing day. Let them talk. She was too busy living to worry about their opinions. The foundation had been cleared and reinforced. They'd begun laying the first logs for the walls, massive timbers that required both of them working in careful coordination. Clara had learned to notch the logs properly, to position them so they'd settle and seal against winter winds. Her hands had developed new calluses, her shoulders new strength. She could feel herself changing, not just physically, but in some deeper way she couldn't quite name. On the third Saturday, as they were positioning a particularly stubborn log, Clara's hand slipped. The timber shifted, catching her palm between itself and the foundation stone. Pain shot through her hand, sharp and immediate. She gasped, jerking back, cradling her injured hand against her chest. Silas was beside her in an instant, his face creased with concern. "Let me see." "It's nothing," she said, but her voice shook. "Let me see, Clara." She extended her hand reluctantly. Blood seeped from a gash across her palm, mixing with the dirt and sawdust. Silas examined it with gentle fingers, his touch surprisingly tender for such a large man. "Needs cleaning and binding." "Come on!" He led her to the creek, knelt beside her on the bank, and carefully washed the wound in the cold water. Clara watched his face as he worked, noting the concentration there, the care. When the blood was cleared, he pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and wrapped her hand with practiced efficiency. "You've done this before," she observed. "Too many times. What teaches you field medicine, whether you want to learn it or not." He tied off the bandage, then looked up at her, his grey eyes serious. "You should rest it for the day. Can't risk infection. We have work to do. Work'll still be here next week. Your hand won't heal right if you push it." They sat together on the creek bank, the water rushing past, neither quite ready to break the moment. Clara found herself studying him in the afternoon light, the lines around his eyes, the scar that traced his cheekbone, the way his shoulders carried a weight that had nothing to do with timber or stone. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "You can ask." Can't promise I'll answer. Why here? Why Ash Hollow? There are easier places to build a life. Silas was quiet for a long time, watching the water. When he spoke, his voice was low. I was married once, long time ago, before the war. Her name was Mary. She was soft, gentle. The kind of woman who belonged in parlors and churches, not frontier cabins. Clara waited, sensing there was more. I tried to be what she needed, tried to be civilized, to fit into town life. But the war changed me, made me hard. When I came back, I couldn't sit still in drawing rooms, couldn't make small talk about weather and gossip. I needed space, silence, work that used my hands instead of just my words. He picked up a smooth stone, turned it over in his fingers. Mary tried to understand, but she couldn't. We grew apart, slow as seasons changing. One day she told me she was leaving, going back east to her family. Said she'd married one man and got back another. She wasn't wrong. I'm sorry, Clara said quietly. Don't be. She deserved better than what I could give her. Some people aren't cut out for gentle living. I reckon I'm one of them. He looked at her then, really looked at her. You understand that, don't you? That need for work that matters, for days that end with your muscles aching and your hands dirty. I do, Clara admitted. She pulled Thomas's pocket watch from her dress pocket, the one she still carried everywhere. It had stopped at the moment of his death, the hands frozen at 3:15. My husband was a good man, kind, but he never really saw me. I was a convenience, someone to keep his house and warm his bed. I loved him because it seemed like the right thing to do, but I don't think I was ever really happy. She looked at the watch, at those stopped hands. I've been carrying this for 3 years, holding on to something that's already gone. I think maybe it's time to let go. Silas didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was gentle. Sometimes the hardest thing is giving yourself permission to move forward, to want something new. Their eyes met, and Clara felt something shift in the air between them, an acknowledgement of possibility, of connection, of two people who'd been alone for too long, finding unexpected understanding. Your hand's going to need proper tending, Silas said, breaking the moment, but not the warmth it had created. I'll take you home early today. They rode back to town in comfortable silence, but it was different now. Something had been said, or maybe just recognized. Clara felt it settling in her chest, that flutter of anticipation she'd tried to deny. When they reached her cabin, Silas dismounted and helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist just a moment longer than necessary. Clara, he said, then seemed to struggle with what to say next. I'm not an easy man. I've got a past that shadows me, and I won't always be good company. But working with you these past weeks, it's been the best part of my days. I want you to know that. Clara's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her with such plain honesty, such direct vulnerability. It's been the best part of mine, too. He smiled then, a real smile that softened his weathered face. I'll see you next Saturday. Take care of that hand. That night, Clara sat in her cabin and looked at Thomas's pocket watch for a long time. Then, with a decisiveness that surprised her, she wrapped it in cloth and placed it in the drawer of her bedside table. Not thrown away, she wasn't ready for that, but put away. Tucked into the past where it belonged. She had work to do, a cabin to build, a future that was starting to take shape, log by log, moment by moment, and maybe, just maybe, someone to share it with. A month into the work, the cabin's skeleton stood complete against the autumn sky. 4 walls rose from the stone foundation. The framework for a roof stretched overhead, and windows waited for glass that Silas had ordered from a supplier 3 towns away. Clara stood back one Saturday afternoon, her injured hand healed now, and marveled at what they'd built together. It felt like more than just timber and stone. It felt like proof of something. The conversations had deepened as the work progressed. They talked while they worked, filling the silence with stories and observations that revealed themselves layer by layer. Clara learned that Silas had served in the frontier wars, campaigns in territories so remote they barely had names. He'd been a scout, then a sergeant, leading men through hostile country where survival depended on reading signs most people never noticed. I learned to see what's hidden, he told her one afternoon as they positioned roof beams. Tracks that tell you how many men passed and how long ago. broken branches that show which way they went. Silence that means danger instead of peace. Is that why you keep watching the tree line? Clara asked. He paused mid-hammer swing, looked at her with surprise. You notice that? I notice a lot about you, Silas. Something flickered in his eyes. Pleasure, maybe, or recognition. Old habits. The war taught me that trouble rarely announces itself. It just shows up. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of their movements synchronized now, each anticipating what the other needed. Then Silas spoke again, his voice quieter. I've done things that follow a man. Clara, things I can't undo, no matter how many cabins I build or how far I run. She set down her hammer, wiped sweat from her brow. We all have things we can't undo. The question is whether we let them define us or whether we define ourselves despite them. You don't know what I've done. No, but I know who you are now. I know you're patient with someone learning. I know you share your food without hesitation. I know you tied my hand with more care than most doctors would show. That's who you are, Silas. Whatever came before, that's history. This is present. He looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes. Then he reached into his saddlebag, which lay near the foundation, and pulled out a folded paper. He handed it to her without a word. Clara unfolded it carefully. It was a military discharge paper, dated 15 years prior, honorable service noted. But clipped to it was something else, a worn notice, official-looking, with Silas's name and physical description. It wasn't a wanted poster exactly, but it was close. A material witness notice, requesting information about his whereabouts regarding a court-martial proceeding. 3 men I served with, Silas said, his voice flat. They killed civilians during a raid. Families who had nothing to do with the fighting, women, children. I reported it. Testified against them at their trial. They went to prison. Clara's hands tightened on the papers. You did the right thing. They got out 6 months ago. Been asking after me in every town between here and Kansas. The implications settled over Clara like cold water. The fire. Can't prove it was them, but I know. They were sending a message. They're not done with me. Clara handed back the papers, her mind racing. This was why he'd chosen Ash Hollow, so remote and small. This was why he scanned the tree line, why he carried himself like a man expecting trouble. Not paranoia, preparation. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to know what you're getting involved with. If you want to stop coming, I'll understand. I'll pay you for the work you've done, and we'll part as friends. But if they find me, and they will eventually, anyone near me will be in danger. Clara thought about the easy thing, the safe thing. She could walk away, return to her predictable life, protect herself from complications. That's what the old Clara would have done, the one who let the town define her, who accepted being overlooked and dismissed, but that Clara was gone, worn away like rough edges on a river stone by hard work and honest companionship and the simple fact of being seen. I'm not going anywhere, she said firmly. Clara, you listen to me. Silas, now you listen. I've spent 3 years being safe, being small, accepting whatever scraps of life people thought I deserved. I'm done with that. This cabin, this work, it's the first time I've felt truly alive since Thomas died. Maybe the first time ever. I won't give that up because of fear. It's not just fear. It's smart. Then call me foolish. She picked up her hammer. Are we finishing this roof or not? Silas stared at her, and she saw emotions chase across his face. Concern, admiration, something deeper that made her heart skip. Then he smiled. That rare, full smile that transformed his weathered features. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. I'll take that as a compliment. They worked through the afternoon with new urgency, as if building the cabin faster might somehow keep the danger at bay. When the rain clouds rolled in suddenly, as mountain weather often did, they were caught on the roof, scrambling to secure tops over the exposed beams. The rain hit hard and fast, a deluge that turned the clearing to mud in minutes. They abandoned the roof, sliding down to take shelter in the partially completed cabin. Water drummed on the tarp overhead, leaked through gaps in the walls, but inside it was dry enough. They stood close together, breathing hard, soaked through. Clara's hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in wet tangles around her face. Silas's shirt was plastered to his chest, water dripping from his beard. They looked at each other, and suddenly the space between them felt charged with more than just storm electricity. "Clara," Silas said, his voice rough. She didn't let him finish. She stepped forward, closing the distance, and kissed him. For a moment he froze, surprised. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close, and he kissed her back with an intensity that stole her breath. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was honest and hungry and full of everything they'd been building toward without acknowledging. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. "Stop deciding what you deserve and just accept what's being offered." He laughed, a sound she'd rarely heard from him. "Yes, ma'am." They stayed in the shelter of the unfinished cabin until the rain passed, sitting close, his arm around her shoulders, her head against his chest. Clara listened to his heartbeat, steady and strong, and felt something settle inside her that had been restless for years. "When this cabin's finished," Silas said quietly, "I'm going to ask you something. But I want to be able to offer you something real. A home, safety, a future. Ask me now," Clara said, "not yet. When it's done. When I can promise you something solid." She didn't argue. They had time. The cabin would be finished in a few more weeks, and then they could start building something even more important. The ride back to town that evening was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of two people who'd crossed a threshold and found something worth keeping on the other side. When they reached Clara's cabin, Silas kissed her again, soft and sweet, a promise for tomorrow. Inside, Clara changed into dry clothes and sat at her small table, a cup of tea warming her hands. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Dalton's light burning across the way, could imagine the gossip already spreading. Let it spread. She'd found something real, something worth fighting for. Even if danger was coming, she'd face it standing beside a man who saw her for who she truly was. That was worth any risk. The following weeks brought a new rhythm to their work. The cabin progressed steadily, windows installed, door hung, interior walls taking shape. But more than that, Clara and Silas were building something between them, something neither had quite dared to name, but both understood. Clara began bringing meals to share at midday. Nothing fancy, stews she'd made the night before, fresh bread, preserves from her small pantry. She carried her mother's old recipe book up to the property one Saturday, its pages water-stained and soft from years of use, and found Silas studying it with genuine interest. "Your mother was a good cook," he said, reading through the recipes written in faded ink. "She made magic from almost nothing. That's what frontier cooking is, taking whatever you have and making it." Enough. They sat together on the cabin's new porch, rough. Planks that would need sanding but were functional, and ate the stew she'd brought. Silas had never been one for flowery words, but Clara saw his appreciation in small gestures, the way he savored each bite, the way he insisted on washing the dishes in the creek, the way he saved the best pieces of meat for her. "I've been thinking," Silas said as they worked on the interior walls that afternoon, "about what comes after. After the cabin's done, after everything. If things were different, if I didn't have 3 dangerous men tracking me, I'd want to build more than just a house. I'd want to build a life. With you." Clara's hands stilled on the board she was measuring. "And because things aren't different, I don't have the right to ask you for something I might not be able to protect." She set down her measuring tape and walked over to him. "Silas Boone, you're the most frustrating man I've ever met. You keep trying to make decisions for me, to protect me from choices I'm capable of making myself. I'm trying to be responsible. You're trying to be noble. There's a difference." She took his hands in hers, rough calluses meeting rough calluses. "Whatever comes, we face it together. That's my choice. Stop trying to take it away from me." He looked at their joined hands, then at her face. "You're certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything." He pulled her close then, kissed her with a tenderness that made her throat tight. When they broke apart, his voice was rough with emotion. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever comes." The confession seemed to free something in him. He opened up more after that, sharing stories from his past that he'd kept locked away. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about a father who'd been hard with his fists and harder with his words, about running away at 15 to join the army, lying about his age because anything was better than home. "I've been running most of my life," he admitted one evening as they sat watching the sunset over the mountains. "Running from my father, from my past, from the things I did in the war. Thought if I could just get far enough away, I could outrun it all." "But you can't outrun yourself," Clara said quietly. "No. Best you can do is try to be better than you were. Build something good to balance the bad." Clara leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his shoulder. "You know what I think? I think you've been running towards something all along, not just away. You just didn't know what it was until you found it. And what's that? Home, not a place, a person. Someone who sees all of you and doesn't ask you to be anyone else." His arm tightened around her. "Is that what you are? My home, I could be. If you let me." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered. Then Silas spoke again, his voice carrying a weight of warning. "There's something you should know. Those 3 men, Cutter Malone, Jack Reese, and Tom Brennan, they're not just angry. They're dangerous, skilled. They know how to track, how to fight, how to kill. When they come, Clara corrected. "You said it yourself. It's not if, it's when." "When they come," Silas agreed grimly. "It's going to be bad. I can hold my own against 1, maybe 2. But 3? And if you're here," he shook his head, "I need to teach you more than just how to shoot. I need to teach you how to survive." Over the next few Saturdays, between building and eating, and the small domestic gestures that were becoming habit, Silas taught Clara skills she'd never imagined needing. How to move quietly through underbrush, how to read tracks and signs, how to set up defensive positions, how to think tactically about terrain and cover. "You're teaching me to fight a war," Clara observed one afternoon. "I'm teaching you to survive one. There's a difference." She proved an apt student, her frontier upbringing giving her a foundation he could build on. She already knew the land, knew how to read weather and wildlife. She just needed to learn how to apply that knowledge to human threats. The town, meanwhile, watched their growing closeness with mixed reactions. Mrs. Dalton had softened somewhat, bringing Clara a basket of preserves one evening with a grudging admission that Mr. Boone seems a decent sort. Despite the circumstances, Mayor Hutchins remained disapproving but silent, perhaps recognizing that Clara was beyond his influence. The children asked daily when Miss Whitfield would return to teaching full-time, and she promised them after the cabin was complete, though she didn't mention she might be teaching from a new home, with a new name. One evening, as Clara prepared for bed, she realized she hadn't thought about Thomas in days. The guilt that followed that realization was lighter than she'd expected. Thomas would have wanted her to be happy, she thought. Would have wanted her to find someone who made her feel fully alive. She was ready to move forward, ready to build a future instead of just surviving the present. All they had to do was finish the cabin and hope that Silas's past stayed buried long enough for them to claim their happiness. But in her heart, Clara knew that hope was a fragile thing, and trouble, when it came, rarely waited for convenient timing. The cabin was nearly complete when the rider came. 6 weeks of work, of building and learning and growing together, and Clara could see the finish line. 1 more Saturday, maybe 2, and they'd have a home. A real home, solid and weatherproof, ready for winter and whatever else came. It was mid-afternoon on a Friday when the rider appeared in Ash Hollow. Clara was dismissing her students for the day when she heard the commotion outside. Voices raised, the sound of a horse being reined in hard. She stepped out onto the schoolhouse porch and saw a man in a county sheriff's uniform talking to Mayor Hutchins, his face grave. Clara's stomach dropped. She knew, even before the words were spoken, that this had something to do with Silas. The sheriff's eyes found her across the street. He dismounted and walked over, his spurs chinking with each step. "Miss Whitfield, I'm Sheriff Dawson from Clearwater County. I need to speak with you about Silas Boone." "What about him?" 3 men, matching descriptions of wanted criminals, were spotted in Pine Ridge 2 days ago. They were asking about a man named Boone, asking specific questions, what he looks like, where he's staying, who his friends are. Sheriff Dawson's expression was sympathetic but professional. "I understand you've been working with Mr. Boone on his property." "I have." "What's this about, Sheriff?" "May we speak inside?" Clara led him into the schoolhouse, her heart pounding. They sat at her desk, while Mayor Hutchins hovered near the door, unable to resist eavesdropping. "What do you know about Silas Boone's past?" The sheriff asked. "He served in the military. He testified against men who committed crimes. Those men went to prison and recently got out. They're looking for him." Sheriff Dawson nodded slowly. "That's mostly accurate, but there's more to the story." He pulled papers from his saddlebag, official documents with territorial seals. "I did some digging when word reached me about the inquiries. Silas Boone did testify against those 3 men, but what he didn't mention to you or anyone else is that he was part of the same unit." "Part of the same raids?" Clara's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Silas Boone participated in the crimes he later testified about. For 2 years, he rode with Cutter Malone's squad, conducting raids that crossed the line from military action into murder and theft. They hit settlements, took supplies, and killed anyone who resisted. Sometimes killed people who didn't resist." The words hit Clara like physical blows. "No, Silas wouldn't." "He did, ma'am. I have the court transcripts right here." Sheriff Dawson spread papers across her desk. "It was only when Malone's squad attacked a Mennonite settlement, families who had no weapons, no involvement in the conflict, that Boone apparently had enough. He reported the massacre, testified in exchange for immunity from prosecution." Clara stared at the documents, her mind reeling. There, in official language, was the truth Silas had edited. He hadn't just witnessed crimes. He'd committed them. He'd been part of the unit that terrorized frontier settlements. Yes, he'd eventually done the right thing, but only after being complicit in horrors for 2 years. His testimony saved his own neck, the sheriff continued. Got him an honorable discharge and a clean record. But Malone and the others went to prison for life. They got out on a technicality 6 months ago, some problem with the trial proceedings. And now they're looking for the man who put them there. Why are you telling me this? Clara asked, her voice hollow. Because those 3 men are dangerous, ma'am. They're not just angry, they're skilled killers who have nothing to lose. If you're with Boone when they find him, you'll be in the crossfire. I'm telling you this so you can protect yourself. Stay away from him. Let this play out without getting yourself killed. Sheriff Dawson gathered his papers. I'm heading up to Boone's property now to warn him. Wanted to stop here first, make sure you knew what you were mixed up in. For what it's worth, Miss Whitfield, you seem like a decent woman. Too decent to die for a man who spent years killing innocents before he finally grew a conscience. He left, and Clara sat in the empty schoolhouse, her world tilting on its axis. She looked at the documents he'd left, scanned the testimony, saw Silas's name again and again, participated in raid, present during execution, failed to intervene. The man she'd fallen for, the man who'd been patient and gentle and honest with her, had been part of something monstrous. Yes, he'd turned on his unit eventually. Yes, he'd done the right thing in the end. But for 2 years before that, he'd done terrible things. He'd been the person his father raised him to be, the one he said he'd been running from. Clara felt betrayed, not by what Silas had done in his past, but by what he'd hidden from her. He'd told her about the testimony, about the danger, but he'd framed himself as a witness, not a participant. He'd let her believe he'd been noble from the start, when the truth was messier and darker. She walked home in a daze, ignoring Mrs. Dalton's curious stare, ignoring the children who called out to her. Inside her cabin, she sat at her small table and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd learned. The rational part of her brain understood that people changed, that someone could do terrible things and later become better, that redemption was possible. Silas had clearly spent 15 years trying to atone, trying to be different than he'd been. But the hurt part of her, the part that had trusted him completely, felt deceived. She'd given him her heart, her body, her trust. She'd defended him to the town, stood by him despite the danger. And he'd let her do all of that without telling her the full truth. She sat there as the sun set, wrestling with her feelings. Love didn't just disappear because someone's past was darker than expected. But trust, that was harder to maintain when it had been built on incomplete truths. A knock on her door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Silas standing there, his face etched with worry and resignation. He'd clearly already spoken to Sheriff Dawson. "I can explain," he said. Can you explain why you let me believe you were just a witness? Why you didn't tell me you participated in those raids for 2 years?" "Because I was ashamed." His voice was raw. "Because I've spent 15 years trying to be anyone but that man, and telling you would have meant admitting he existed, that he still exists, somewhere inside me. I deserved the truth, Silas, all of it. You did." "You're right." He stepped closer, his hands open, pleading. "Clara, I'm not that man anymore. Haven't been since the day I saw what Malone did to those families. Children, Clara. They killed children for refusing to hand over food they didn't even have. That's when something broke inside me, or maybe fixed itself. I don't know. But I reported it immediately, turned on my entire unit, risked execution for treason to make sure they faced justice. After 2 years of following their orders." Yes, he didn't flinch from the accusation. "After 2 years of being a coward, of telling myself I was just following orders, that war made people do terrible things, that survival meant keeping your head down. Every excuse a weak man tells himself." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the guilt he carried, the weight of it in his shoulders, the shadows in his eyes. This was a man who'd been punishing himself for 15 years, who'd isolated himself from human connection because he didn't believe he deserved it. "I love you," Silas said quietly. "I know I don't have the right to, given what I've done, but I do. And I understand if you can't love me back. Not now that you know everything." Clara's throat tightened. She did love him. That hadn't changed. But love and trust weren't the same thing, and trust needed honesty to survive. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to think about this, about us, about whether I can build a life with someone who kept something this important from me." Pain flashed across Silas's face, but he nodded. "That's fair. That's more than fair." He backed toward the door. "The cabin's almost done. 1 more day's work and it'll be finished. If you decide, if you can forgive me, it's yours, ours, whatever you want." He paused at the threshold. "Those men are close, Clara. Sheriff says they were in Pine Ridge 2 days ago. That's less than a day's ride from here. Stay in town, stay safe. Promise me that, at least. I promise." He left, and Clara closed the door, leaning against it as tears finally came. She'd found something real, something worth fighting for. And now it was complicated by truths that changed everything while changing nothing at all. She loved a man who'd done terrible things before becoming good. The question was whether she could live with that, whether the man he was now outweighed the man he'd been. She had until tomorrow to decide. Because whether she forgave him or not, danger was coming. And when it arrived, she'd have to choose, walk away and stay safe, or stand beside him and face whatever came. Her father's gloves sat on the table, worn and patched. Beside them, Thomas's pocket watch still stopped at 3:15. Artifacts of her past, reminders of the people who'd shaped her, but the future, that was still being written. And only she could decide what it would say. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat in Thomas's rocking chair, wrapped in a quilt, watching the fire burn down to embers as her mind turned over the question that wouldn't let her rest. Not whether she loved Silas, she did, and that truth was as immutable as the mountains outside her window. The question was whether she could trust him, whether a future built on incomplete truths could stand when tested. By the time dawn broke, pale and cold, Clara had her answer. It came not from logic or reason, but from a deeper place. The same place that had made her volunteer to work on Silas's cabin when no one else would. The same place that had driven her to keep teaching after Thomas died, to keep chopping wood alone, to keep existing when existing felt like the hardest thing in the world. She was tired of being afraid, tired of letting fear make her decisions, tired of accepting less than she deserved because it felt safer than reaching for more. Silas had done terrible things. Yes, but he'd also spent 15 years trying to atone. He'd turned on his own unit, risked execution, testified knowing it would make him a marked man. He'd chosen to be better, even when better was harder. That took courage most people never found, and more than that, he'd seen her. Not the plain schoolteacher the town overlooked, but the strong, capable woman she actually was. He'd treated her with respect and honesty, at least about who he was now, even if his past had been edited for protection. Clara rose from the chair, stiff from sitting all night, and made her decision. She would go to him. She would help him face what was coming, and when it was over, if they survived, they would build their future on complete honesty, starting fresh with nothing hidden. She dressed in her work clothes, packed a small bag with essentials, and strapped on her father's old pistol, a weapon she'd barely touched since he died, but that Silas had taught her to clean and load. Then she pulled out her teaching slate from the schoolhouse, the one inscribed with all her students' names. She ran her fingers over the chalk-marked names, Mary Beth, Samuel, the Dalton twins, all of them. This was what she was fighting to return to. Her life, her purpose, her future. She walked to the schoolhouse as the town began waking, left a note on the door. School closed today and tomorrow. Will resume Monday. Miss Whitfield. Then she went to the livery stable, saddled Belle. Silas had left her there for Clara's use, and rode out before anyone could stop her with questions. The ride to Silas's property had never felt longer. Every shadow seemed threatening, every bird call a potential warning. But Clara kept Belle at a steady pace, her hand near her pistol, her eyes scanning the forest the way Silas had taught her. She found him on the cabin's porch, sitting with his rifle across his knees, looking like he hadn't slept either. He stood when he saw her, surprise and hope and fear chasing across his weathered face. "Clara, you shouldn't be here." "It's not safe. I'm staying," she said, dismounting. "We do this together. You said you needed time. I had all night." That was enough. She walked up the porch steps, stood in front of him, and took his free hand. "I'm angry that you didn't tell me everything. I'm hurt that you let me believe a version of you that was incomplete. But I understand why you did it, and I've decided that who you are now matters more than who you were then." Silas's eyes glistened. "Clara, let me finish. If we're going to do this, if we're going to build a life together, it has to be built on truth. All of it. No more editing your past to make yourself look better. I need to know all of you, even the parts that are hard to tell. I can do that. I will do that. Then we prepare. You said they're coming. Let's make sure we're ready." Something in Silas's posture shifted, from guilt and resignation to determination. He nodded, squeezed her hand, then released it and became all business. "They'll come in the next day or two. 3 men, all experienced fighters. Cutter Malone leads them. He's the most dangerous. Smart, ruthless, patient. Jack Reese is the muscle, big and mean, but not particularly bright. Tom Brennan is the tracker, the one who's been following my trail. He's quiet, methodical, deadly accurate with a rifle." Silas moved to the cabin's interior, and Clara followed. He'd already begun preparing. Ammunition laid out on the table, supplies stocked, water barrels filled. The cabin's strategic advantages were clear now that Clara knew to look for them. Good sight lines from the windows, solid walls that would stop most bullets, the creek providing water access, forest cover for retreat if necessary. "Here's what we do," Silas said, spreading a rough sketch of the property on the table. "They'll likely approach from the south. It's the easiest route, and Brennan will track me from town that direction. We fortify the cabin, set up crossfire positions. I'll take the loft window with my rifle. I can cover the southern and eastern approaches from there. You take the western window on the main floor. It's got cover from the stone fireplace and a clear field of fire." Clara studied the sketch, her mind working through the tactics he'd been teaching her. "What about the northern side?" "Steep drop-off. They'd be fools to approach that way, but we'll set up noisemakers, tin cans on string, so we'll hear if anyone tries." They spent the morning fortifying their position. Silas moved furniture to create better cover, positioned water and ammunition within easy reach of both firing positions, and reinforced the door with extra boards. Clara helped, her hands steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. By midday, they'd done everything they could to prepare the cabin itself. Silas then took her outside, showing her the defensive measures he'd already set up over the past few days. Shallow pits that could trip a running man, branches arranged to channel attackers toward kill zones, sightlines cleared to eliminate surprise approaches. "You've been expecting this," Clara observed, "since the day I bought this land. Maybe since the day I testified. I knew they'd come eventually." He looked at her, his face serious. "Clara, when it starts, and it will be sudden, violent, you follow my lead. You don't hesitate. You don't try to wound instead of kill. You shoot to stop the threat. These men won't show you mercy just because you're a woman. I understand. Do you?" "Really?" He gripped her shoulders gently. "I need you to understand that what's coming isn't like target practice or hunting. It's men trying to kill us, and we have to be willing to do the same to them." Clara thought of her students, of the life waiting for her back in town, of everything she had to lose. Then she thought of the alternative, running, hiding, living in fear, giving up the first real happiness she'd found in years. "I understand," she said firmly, "and I'm ready." They ate an early supper together, salt pork and beans, bread Clara had brought from town, sitting on the cabin steps and watching the sun descend toward the mountains. It felt surreal, this domesticity before violence, but also somehow right. They were building their last moments of peace before the storm. "When this is over," Silas said quietly, "I want to ask you something, but I need to be able to offer you something solid. A home, safety, a future." "Ask me now," Clara said, echoing what she'd said weeks ago. "Not yet. After. Give us something to fight for." As darkness fell, they moved into the cabin. Silas took first watch in the loft, his rifle ready, while Clara tried to rest on the makeshift bed below, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay there, listening to the night sounds, owls calling, wind through the pines, the creek's constant whisper, and wondered if these would be the last peaceful sounds she'd ever hear. Around midnight, Silas came down from the loft and sat beside her. "Can't sleep either." "Too much thinking. Want to share?" Clara sat up, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. "I was thinking about my father. He used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward despite it. I never really understood that until now. He sounds like he was a wise man. He was. He would have liked you, I think. Would have respected what you've become, regardless of what you were." Silas took her hand. "I'm terrified, Clara. Not for me. I accepted the consequences of my choices a long time ago. But for you, if something happens to you because of my past, then it happens because of my choice. My decision to stand with you. Don't take that away from me by drowning in guilt before anything's even happened." He pulled her close, and they sat together in the darkness, holding each other, finding strength in shared warmth. Eventually Silas returned to his watch, and Clara drifted into fitful sleep, her dreams full of shadows and gunfire. She woke to his hand on her shoulder, gentle but urgent. Dawn was breaking outside, painting the windows grey. "They're here," Silas whispered. Clara's heart lurched, but her hands were steady as she reached for her rifle. This was it. Everything they'd prepared for, everything they'd feared. 3 dangerous men against 2 people who'd found each other in loneliness and built something worth defending. She took her position at the western window, checked her ammunition, controlled her breathing the way Silas had taught her. Through the window, she could see movement in the tree line, 3 figures spread out, approaching with tactical precision. Silas was in the loft, his rifle trained on the southern approach. His voice drifted down, calm and steady. "Remember, Clara, shoot to stop. Don't hesitate, and know that whatever happens, loving you has been the best thing I've ever done." "Same," Clara whispered, then raised her rifle and prepared to fight for the life she'd chosen. In the growing light, she could see them clearly now, 3 men, hard and purposeful, coming to settle old scores. Coming to finish what they'd started with the fire, but they didn't know that the lonely schoolteacher they'd probably heard about was anything but weak. They didn't know that she could swing an axe, pull a trigger, and stand her ground against impossible odds. They were about to find out what real strength looked like. The first shot shattered the morning silence, and the battle for their future began. The shot came from the southern tree line, a ranging shot, testing their defenses. It splintered wood near the cabin's eave, deliberate and controlled. Not trying to hit anyone, just announcing their arrival. "Hold your fire," Silas called down from the loft. "Let them commit." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady on the rifle. Through the western window, she could see two figures moving through the trees. One large, moving with the heavy confidence of someone who relied on strength, and another smaller, more careful. The third would be positioned somewhere to the south, within Silas's sightline. "Boone!" A voice carried across the clearing, rough with years of hard living. "Been a long time." "Cutter Malone?" Clara recognized him from Silas's description. Medium height, wiry build, eyes that missed nothing. He stepped partially into view on the southern edge, using a thick pine for cover, his rifle held casually, but ready. "Nothing to talk about, Cutter," Silas called back. "You should leave while you can. Leave. We rode 300 miles to have a conversation with you." 15 years' worth of conversation. Malone's laugh was bitter. "You put us in hell for a decade and a half, brother. Took everything from us. Now we're here to collect what's owed. You put yourselves in prison when you murdered innocent people. I just made sure you answered for it. Innocent?" Malone spat. "Ain't no such thing on the frontier, Boone. You knew that. You rode with us for 2 years. Suddenly grew yourself a conscience after we hit one settlement too many? You were just as guilty as the rest of us." Clara heard the truth in those words, felt them land like stones. But she also heard the difference between Silas and the men outside. He'd found his conscience. They clearly hadn't. "Last chance," Silas said, his voice hard. "Right away. This doesn't have to end badly." "Oh, but it does." Malone gestured, and the two other figures began moving, flanking positions, coordinated and professional. These weren't angry thugs. They were trained soldiers executing a tactical approach. Clara tracked the big man, Jack Reese, as he moved toward the western side. He was using the terrain well, staying behind cover, but he was heading straight toward her window. She adjusted her aim, leading his movement, waiting for Silas's signal. The dented military compass sat on the windowsill beside her, the same compass Silas carried through the war, the one that had stopped a bullet meant for his heart. He'd placed it there this morning, a talisman, a reminder that survival was possible even against bad odds. "Clara," Silas called softly. "Western approach, 30 yards, moving to your 2 o'clock. I see him. When he breaks cover, you take the shot. Don't wait for perfect." "Good enough is good enough." Reese was getting closer, his bulk visible through the gaps in the trees. He was moving toward the cabin's blind spot, the corner where 2 walls met, probably planning to use it for cover, while Malone and Brennan engaged from the other sides. Smart tactics. But Silas had anticipated it. "Now, Clara." Reese broke from the tree line, running low and fast toward the cabin corner. Clara tracked him, led him slightly for movement, and squeezed the trigger the way Silas had taught her, smooth, controlled, inevitable. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. Through the smoke, she saw Reese stumble, grab his leg, and fall behind a fallen log 20 yards out. Not a kill shot, but enough to stop his advance and change his day considerably. "Good shot," Silas said, and Clara felt a surge of grim satisfaction mixed with horror at what she'd just done. She'd shot a man, actually pulled the trigger and sent lead into human flesh. The reality of it hit her harder than the rifle's kick, but there was no time to process. Gunfire erupted from the southern side, Malone laying down covering fire while Brennan moved. Bullets punched through the cabin's walls, sent splinters flying, forced Clara to duck behind the stone fireplace. From the loft came the sharp crack of Silas's rifle, once, twice, measured and deliberate. She heard a curse from outside, the sound of someone scrambling for better cover. "Brennan's hit," Silas reported. "Shoulder wound. He's behind the old pine, southern edge. 2 men wounded in the first minute. But that made them more dangerous, not less. Wounded animals fought harder, and these were no animals. They were trained killers with nothing to lose. The gunfire stopped, sudden silence more ominous than the noise. Clara's ears rang. She could smell gunpowder and pine sap, taste copper fear on her tongue. Her hands shook now that the immediate action had passed, adrenaline flooding her system. "They're regrouping," Silas said quietly. "Assessing. Figuring out we're not the easy targets they expected. This is when it gets dangerous. When they stop being cautious and start being desperate." Clara checked her ammunition, reloaded, tried to control her breathing. Outside, she could hear low voices conferring, planning. Reese was cursing steadily, his voice tight with pain. Brennan was silent, which worried her more, and Malone was laughing softly. The sound carrying across the clearing like a promise of violence yet to come. "You always did know how to set up a defense, Boone," Malone called out. "Taught you well, didn't I? But here's the thing about sieges. They only last as long as the supplies. How much ammunition you got in there? How much water? How long before you have to come out?" Silas didn't answer, which was answer enough. They had resources for a day, maybe 2 if they rationed. But Malone had patience and reinforcements if he needed them. The question wasn't whether they could hold out. It was whether they could win before resources became an issue. Clara looked at the compass beside her, at its dented face, still showing true north despite the damage it had taken. Guidance through impossible situations. Survival when death seemed certain. She picked it up, held it tight, then set it back down and raised her rifle again. They weren't done yet. The stalemate lasted 2 hours. The sun climbed higher, turning the cabin into an oven. Clara's dress was soaked with sweat, her throat parched despite the water they'd stored. Outside, the 3 men waited, occasionally taking shots to keep them pinned, conserving ammunition for when it mattered. Clara's teaching lesson plan was still folded in her dress pocket, the one she'd brought without thinking. Next week's reading assignments, arithmetic problems, a note to remember Mary Beth's birthday. She touched it through the fabric, grounding herself in the life waiting on the other side of this violence. "They're going to try something soon," Silas said from above. "They can't afford to wait us out. Someone from town might come investigating." As if summoned by his words, movement exploded from multiple directions. Malone broke cover on the south side, firing rapidly while Brennan, wounded shoulder and all, sprinted toward the eastern wall. And from the west, Reese began crawling toward the cabin, dragging his wounded leg, but carrying a bottle with a rag stuffed in the top. Fire. They were going to try to burn them out. "Reese has fire," Clara shouted, swinging her rifle toward the big man's crawling form. But Malone's covering fire forced her back behind the fireplace before she could aim properly. "I've got Brennan," Silas called, and his rifle cracked twice in rapid succession. Clara heard a scream, Brennan's voice high and shocked. She risked a glance out the window and saw him sprawled at the cabin's base, not moving. Dead or dying, she couldn't tell, but out of the fight either way. But Reese was still coming, and the bottle in his hand was lit now, flame guttering at the rag. 10 yards from the cabin. 8. If he got that bottle against the wooden walls, Clara stepped into the window's opening, exposed but with a clear shot. Time seemed to slow. She could see Reese's face, twisted with pain and determination. Could see the arc of his arm as he prepared to throw. Could see Malone swinging his rifle toward her, his eyes widening as he realized what she was doing. She fired. The bullet caught Reese in the chest. His throw went wild, the bottle spinning through the air to shatter harmlessly on the stone foundation. Flames spreading across bare rock where they could do no damage before dying out. But Malone's shot came simultaneously. Clara felt impact, burning pain across her left arm, and she fell back from the window into the cabin's interior. Blood soaked her sleeve instantly, hot and slick. Silas was down the loft ladder in seconds, crouching beside her, his hands already examining the wound. "How bad?" "I'm all right," she gasped, though the pain was excruciating. "Just grazed, I think." He tore fabric from his shirt, bound her arm quickly and efficiently. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop. "You need to stay down. Let me finish this." "No." Clara grabbed his arm with her good hand. "2 shooters, remember?" "That was your plan. I can still pull a trigger." Outside, Malone was shouting, his voice finally losing its amused edge. "Jack, Tom, answer me! Silence!" Both his companions were down. It was just him now, one man against two, though Clara was wounded and Silas was exposed if he tried to cover both windows at once. "Boone!" Malone's voice had changed, not frightened but calculating. "Your woman's hit. I can hear it in how quiet she got. How long you think she'll last? That looked like a good shot. Could have hit an artery. Could be bleeding out right now while you and I waste time." Silas's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. "Tell you what," Malone continued. "You come out, face me like a man, and I'll let her live. Hell, I'll even ride to town, send back help for her. All I want is you, brother. All I've ever wanted is you." "Don't," Clara whispered. "Don't you dare. She's dying, Boone. Every second you wait is a second closer to losing her. Is your pride worth her life?" Silas looked at Clara, and she saw the war in his eyes. Duty versus love, honor versus survival. She grabbed his shirt with her good hand, pulled him close. "If you go out there, we both die. He'll kill you, then come in here and finish me. You know that." Her voice was steady despite the pain. "We end this together. That's what you promised." For a long moment, Silas didn't move. Then he nodded, kissed her forehead, and moved back to the window. "Malone," he called out. "You want me? Come and get me. But you'll have to come through her first, and you already learned she can shoot." The silence that followed was profound. Then Malone laughed, but it was bitter now. The laugh of a man who'd lost before he'd even realized the game had changed. "You always were a sentimental fool. Boone, that's what got you in the end. You cared. The rest of us, we stopped caring after the first year. Made life easier. Made you monsters," Silas replied. More silence. Clara could hear Malone moving, repositioning. He was trying to flank them, she realized, trying to find an angle where he could see into the cabin without exposing himself. But Silas had chosen this ground carefully. Every approach had vulnerabilities. The shot, when it came, was from an unexpected direction. The northern side, the steep drop-off they'd thought was impassable. Malone had circled around, climbed the difficult terrain, and was now firing from a position that bypassed their prepared defenses. Glass shattered as his bullet came through the northern window. Silas dropped flat, rolled, came up firing. Clara swung her rifle one-handed, ignoring the agony in her wounded arm, and fired toward the muzzle flash. Then the cabin door crashed open, and Malone was inside, his rifle swinging toward Silas. His face a mask of triumph and rage. Clara didn't hesitate. She fired from where she lay, the rifle bucking against her wounded shoulder, white-hot pain exploding through her arm. Malone's rifle discharged into the ceiling as he fell, surprise frozen on his face. He looked at Clara, at this plain schoolteacher who'd just ended his life, and something like respect flickered across his features before the light left his eyes. Then silence. Real silence this time, broken only by Clara and Silas's harsh breathing. It was over. They'd survived. 3 months later, autumn had given way to early winter, and the first snow dusted the Bitterroot Mountains like sugar on fresh bread. Clara stood on the expanded porch of the cabin, their cabin now, watching the sun paint the valley in shades of gold and pink. Her left arm still ached when the weather turned cold, a permanent reminder of the morning that had changed everything. But the wound had healed clean. Sheriff Dawson had been right about one thing. She was lucky. The cabin bore new marks, too, bullet holes in the walls that Silas had patched but left slightly visible. A deliberate choice. "Scars tell stories," he'd said. "Hiding them doesn't make them go away." Inside, the smell of dinner cooking filled the air. Venison stew from her mother's recipe book, cornbread browning in the oven. The book sat open on the new kitchen table Silas had built, its water-stained pages looking more at home here than they ever had in her small cabin in town. That cabin sat empty now, rented to a new family who'd moved to Ash Hollow, seeking the same fresh start she'd once hoped for. Clara heard hoofbeats and turned to see a familiar group approaching. Mrs. Dalton driving a wagon, with Mayor Hutchins riding alongside and several townspeople walking behind. This had become a Sunday ritual over the past month, the town coming to them, a reversal of how things had been before. The schoolhouse in town had closed permanently. Clara now taught in the cabin's new addition, a room Silas had built specifically for that purpose, with windows facing east for morning light and enough space for 15 students. Every weekday, families from Ash Hollow and even Pine Ridge brought their children up the mountain road. What had once been isolation had become community. Miss Whitfield, Mrs. Boone, Mary Beth Hutchins called out, scrambling down from the wagon before it had fully stopped. The girl had grown 2 inches in 3 months and lost another tooth, but her enthusiasm remained constant. "I finished the whole book. The one about the explorers." "That's wonderful, Mary Beth. We'll discuss it in class tomorrow." Clara smiled as the other children tumbled out, running to the addition where they'd left their previous projects. Mrs. Dalton approached more sedately, carrying a basket. "I brought you some of my preserves, and I wanted to thank you again for taking on the Brennan boy. I know it couldn't have been easy." It hadn't been. Tom Brennan had left behind a 10-year-old son in Pine Ridge, a boy who'd been living with relatives who didn't want him. When Clara heard she'd ridden to Pine Ridge herself, looked at the scared, angry child and brought him home. Young Thomas Brennan now slept in the cabin's loft and was learning slowly that the sins of fathers didn't have to define their sons. "He's doing well," Clara said. "Struggles with reading, but he's got a gift for numbers. And he's gentle with the younger children." Silas emerged from the barn, his sleeves rolled up despite the cold sawdust in his hair from the rocking horse he was building for Samuel Chen's baby sister. He'd become a craftsman, his military precision translating into furniture that was both beautiful and functional. Orders came from towns as far as 3 days' ride away. "Hutchins," Silas nodded to the mayor. "You bring that contract?" "I did." The mayor dismounted, his manner towards Silas much changed from their first meeting. Respect earned through survival and integrity had replaced suspicion. "Town council approved your proposal." "You'll supply timber for the new church, and we'll pay market rate plus 10% for quality." They shook hands, and Clara felt a swell of pride. Silas had worked hard to rebuild not just his reputation, but his place in the community. He attended town meetings now, offered his expertise on matters of safety and construction, and had become someone people turned to for advice. The afternoon passed in comfortable community, the children playing in the snow, adults sharing news and gossip, the kind of ordinary life that felt extraordinary after everything they'd survived. Sheriff Dawson had testified at the inquest, confirming that Silas and Clara had acted in self-defense. The territorial judge had reviewed the evidence, questioned them both, and ruled the deaths justified. Cutter Malone, Jack Reese, and Tom Brennan had been buried in Pine Ridge, their graves marked but unvisited. As sunset approached and their visitors began the journey back to town, Silas and Clara stood together on the porch, his arm around her shoulders, watching the sky turn purple and gold. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Giving up your quiet life for all this?" Clara thought about the question honestly. Her life now was harder in some ways. More work, more responsibility, more complications. But it was also fuller, richer, more genuinely hers than anything before had been. "Not for a second," she said. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 simple iron bands, rings he'd forged himself in the past week. They'd married quietly a month ago, a simple ceremony with Sheriff Dawson officiating and Mrs. Dalton weeping happily in the front row. But Silas had wanted to mark the occasion with something lasting, something he'd made with his own hands. "I know we already did the ceremony," he said, "but I wanted to do this right, to ask you proper, with something solid to offer." He slipped 1 ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, warm from his pocket. Then he held out the other. "Clara Boone, you've made me better than I ever thought I could be. You saw strength in me when I only saw failure, and you showed me what real courage looks like. Will you continue to build this life with me? Continue to be my home?" Clara's throat tightened. She took the 2nd ring and slipped it onto his finger. "I will, for as long as we both live." They kissed as the sun finally set, 2 people who'd been lonely and lost finding each other through grit and grace. The cabin behind them was more than shelter. It was proof that people could change, that love built on honesty and respect could survive anything, that strength came in forms the world often overlooked. Inside, young Thomas called out that dinner was ready, his voice tentative but growing stronger each day. The other children's laughter drifted from the addition where they were playing one last game before heading home. This was their life now. Not perfect, not without challenges, but real and honest and worth every hardship that had brought them here. Clara looked at the ring on her finger, then at the man beside her. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" she asked, echoing a question from months ago. Silas smiled, that rare, full smile that softened his weathered face. "No, ma'am, but I'm grateful every day we did." They went inside together as the first stars appeared, ready for dinner and family and the quiet evening rituals of a life well lived. The bullet holes in the walls caught the firelight, and Clara thought about what Silas had said. Scars tell stories. Their story was written in wood and stone, in healed wounds and new beginnings, in a cabin built by two people who'd refused to let their pasts define their future. She'd spent years believing she wasn't beautiful, wasn't worthy of love or happiness. But Silas had taught her something more important. Beauty wasn't about appearance. It was about courage and character, about the strength to stand firm when the world pushed back, about choosing to build rather than accepting what you were given. "I never felt beautiful until you saw me for who I really was," Clara whispered as they stood in their home. Surrounded by the life they'd created, Silas pulled her close, his voice rough with emotion. "That's because beautiful ain't what you are, Clara. It's what you do. And you, Clara Boone, are the strongest, most beautiful soul I've ever known." Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, covering the valley in white, making everything clean and new. Inside, the fire crackled, dinner waited, and two people who'd found each other against all odds sat down to share another meal, another evening. Another moment of the life they'd fought so hard to claim. The schoolhouse bell, the cracked one Clara had brought from town, hung on the porch now, ready to call students each morning. Thomas's pocket watch sat in a drawer upstairs, no longer carried but not forgotten. Her father's gloves hung by the door, ready for work that would never end but would always be worth doing. And on the mantel, in a place of honor, sat Silas's dented compass, the one that had guided him through war and wandering, through guilt and redemption, and finally home to a woman who taught him that the strongest hearts often beat in the quietest chests. Their story had begun with loneliness and doubt. It had survived fire and violence and the weight of past sins. And it would continue day by day, log by log, moment by moment, built on the foundation of two simple truths. Real strength isn't loud or showy. It's quiet and persistent and shows up every day. And love, true love, isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone willing to build something real, scars and all, and never giving up on what you've created together. As the snow fell and the fire burned and the evening settled into comfortable domesticity, Clara Boone smiled. She was home. Finally, completely, truly home, and it was beautiful.